LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains disturbing references to violence and the abuse of children. Please listen with care. Over a third of all police-recorded sexual offences in the UK are against children. It is estimated that 1 in 20 children are abused. So what happens when police ignore the victims and the perpetrators are never investigated? Maggie Oliver is a former English detective constable, best known as a whistleblower for exposing the poor handling of 2 high-profile child abuse cases. It was a later-in-life decision to join the police. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives.
The day that I swore my oath of attestation for Greater Manchester Police, it was actually my 42nd birthday, and I'd just done a full-time degree at university. I was going to teach. I was married. I'd met my husband when I was 20. We had 4 children. My youngest at the point I joined was 8, and I'd been at home for about 12 years, 13 years maybe. So it really was a baptism of fire, but I wanted to contribute to society. I wanted to do something that made a difference. I'm a bit of a workaholic. I like a purpose in life. My kids didn't quite need me quite as much, and I wanted to prepare for the next 20, 30 years ahead. I don't even know why I applied to go in the police, because most people would have said I would be more likely to go into as a social worker. So I really don't know what made me apply, but I look back now where I am now and the age I am now, and I think, was my life mapped out for me in a way? Because I find myself where I am, and I couldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't had that grounding, studied law. It was a real baptism of fire, because when I did join, I was thrown straight into the deep end in Manchester, a place called Moss Side. It was 1997, so all guns and gangs and drugs and murders and shootings. And, I'm a kind of a middle-class mum from the suburbs, and I thought they'd send me into a school and instead I'm there in the thick of it. So it was really a shock to my system. But you know what? I had life experience. I was good with people. People trusted me because I didn't come across as officious. I went into the job, Brent, with the attitude, kind of do as you would be done by. I didn't know it all, but I treated people fairly. I didn't see my job as a police officer to be the judge and jury. My job was to collect the evidence, and it was for a jury and a court to judge somebody. So I think I came across as a human being, not a uniform, if you like.
42, you've got 4 children, you're going into situations. Doesn't surprise me at all that you were sort of quite fast-tracked through. You found a bit of a niche, didn't you, Maggie, within the job?
Yeah, I kind of did. When I joined, I wanted to go into child protection, but in England, you have to do 2 years in uniform. And I never wanted to do uniform police, and I didn't want to do traffic and all of that. But when I landed in Moss Side, they called it Gunchester at the time, because it really was the very explosive environment to work in. But as well as all the gangs and the guns and the drug crime, it was city centre Manchester, and we had the universities on us. We had children's homes. We had kids going missing from home every day. We had a lot of housing. So the young lads were gung-ho, wanted to be in the cars, chasing the gangsters. And so I'd get sent to the domestics, to the rape, to the children missing from home. I found my probation really difficult, actually. I think because I was 42. I had a very well-developed sense of right and wrong. I wasn't great at just doing as you're told if it didn't make sense. I remember once being sent to a job where 4 little kids had eaten 4 sausage rolls, and the policy was that you lock every shoplifter up. Well, I brought the parents in and I made them pay for the sausage rolls, and I nearly lost my job because the policy was to arrest. Well, I thought, you're going to have 4 double-manned vans, you're going to have 4 appropriate adults, you're going to have 4 legal teams for 4 sausage rolls. Come on. So I always kind of looked out the box. But almost immediately outside of my probation, I was called in by the superintendent, and I was asked whether I might take on a witness protection job, a very, very serious gang job where we had 1 eyewitness. The forced witness protection would relocate the witness and his uncle. There were another family of 5 living in the same house. And I'd never had any training. I didn't have a clue. But I've got my own family. Like you say, I had life experience. And so I said, well, yeah, I'll give it a go. And I joined the major incident team then. I wasn't a detective, but when I went in there, I absolutely loved it. And I had kind of got a little niche there that, the family accepted me. I was really good with people. And I never really went back into uniform again. From there, I progressed fairly quickly into CID. I became a family liaison officer. So I just worked in major crime. I went on to kidnappings and murders, a lot of gang-related shootings, abductions, those kind of things, until in 2000. I did do a little bit of time in child protection, but I very quickly realised, Brent, that it wasn't for me because I couldn't accept social workers telling me that they were working with the family. When I believed a child was being sexually abused, I couldn't come home and forget about it. So I thought, you know what, I'll have World War III every day if I stay here. So I stepped back from that and I stayed in serious crime until 2004, when I was kind of headhunted for this job that became known as Operation Augusta. So that was my early years, my first 5 years.
That's a nice little segue, Maggie, into having a bit of a chat about that Operation Augusta, because this was a big operation and one that started to take you on a pathway which inevitably led to you leaving the job some years later. But I'd like to take a couple of steps back. As you said, it was around 2004 you were headhunted within the Greater Manchester Police for this role. It was looking into the ongoing sexual abuse of vulnerable children, a large number of them. Can you have a bit of a chat to us about that operation and your role in it?
What happened was I was asked to go on that job. There'd been a little girl called Victoria Agolia. Her mum had died when she was 8, and she was one of 5 children who then were taken into the care of social services. Over a period of years, 5-6 years, she was, passed from pillar to post. She was horrendously sexually abused. She was neglected and failed miserably by the authorities here. And that culminated, I think she was just 15, with her being given a drugs overdose by one of her abusers, and she died. Now, that was the catalyst to put together Operation Augusta. And I was approached and said, look, we've got this job, we've got this little girl who died. Will you come and join this operation? What I didn't know then was over the Pennines in England, so not the same police force area, but in Yorkshire, there had been a documentary team that did a program called Edge of the City. And in that program, they'd been shadowing a social services team over a period of, 6 months or something. And they had uncovered a problem with men grooming and sexually abusing on a pretty big scale very vulnerable children who were living in care homes predominantly. At that point in time, I didn't know that kind of abuse really was one pattern of abuse, because it had never been spoken about in the UK, not publicly anyway. But what I didn't know then was that documentary was an injunction was applied for and won by the authorities to prevent that program from going out, because it was feared there would be a public outcry when that became public. Now, at the same time as all that arguing and to and fro was going on, Victoria died in Manchester. So Operation Augusta was put together because she had been subjected to exactly the same kind of grooming by the same makeup of abusers. And I know now that Greater Manchester Police thought that when this programme finally went out in Yorkshire, there would be a public outcry. And because Victoria had been abused and died in the same way, I believe now they wanted to be able to say they had got a problem, but we were looking at whether it was, whether it really was a problem. So I went on Operation Augusta, and initially there were three officers and a DI leading it. And within the space of a few weeks, we knew that this was a massive problem. We had already identified a couple of dozen children who were being pretty much raped every day by gangs of men. Within the space of weeks, we'd identified almost 100 men who were abusing these children, picking them up outside care homes, taking them to addresses where there were gangs of men, and they'd pass a child round the room and each one of them would rape them. It was just horrendous. We did an initial report because we needed more staff, more resources. And I took that report to the head of crime within Greater Manchester Police, begging for a team. And we were given that team to investigate. And we started Augusta, and we were running it on a paper system. But when we got more resources, we were given a computer system, and all the information we'd gathered over the space of about a year by that time was being put on the computer. Now, at exactly that time, sadly, my husband, who I'd been with since I was 20, so we'd been together 30 years, he was terminally ill with bowel cancer. And I went off work in the last couple of months of his life to look after him, knowing that job was kind of a runner. We were ready to arrest and charge and prosecute these abusers. So I went off sort of with peace of mind, knowing that job was going to go. After my husband Norman died a couple of months later, I came back to work, and I found, to my horror, that whole job had just been buried. It had completely disappeared. Not one man was charged with the rapes. Those children were just abandoned. Nobody was doing anything about it, and it was as though it had never happened. The home system, which was the computer system that it was being run on, had been completely closed down, and nobody was charged. And I was in a really bad place. I'd lost my husband, I'd got 4 kids. I didn't really know how I was going to move on with my life. But at the same time, I knew that job should have run. But wherever I turned, nobody wanted to listen. They said there was no evidence, which I knew was wrong. I knew it was a lie. But I didn't have a shred of paperwork to back up what I was saying. I had no evidence. But in my head, I knew what the facts were. And I knew that for me, this was gross criminal neglect. But how was I going to prove it? Nobody wanted to listen. I went to all the senior officers. And in the end, I kind of had to let it go. But I never let it go in my head. So I went back to my normal duties. By this time, I was in the major incident team, went back working on serious crime, but I couldn't make sense of what I'd seen, to be honest, Brent. You know that when you join the police, you swear an oath of attestation that you promise to uphold the law, that you will protect the vulnerable, that you will uphold fundamental human rights, that you will act with integrity and honesty, and you'll do it to the best of your ability. And I knew that like 50, 60-year-old men having sex, raping 11 and 12-year-old children on a daily basis, I promised that I would uphold the law, and that's against the law. I didn't promise to do as I was told. I didn't promise to turn a blind eye. So whichever way I looked, I couldn't make any sense of this, Brent. So it never left me, but I had to let go of it because I couldn't prove what I knew to be true. So I went back to my normal duties until in 2010, sort of 5 years later, I was asked to go and speak to a senior officer, and I was basically told, which I knew anyway, but I was told that there was a new job breaking in Rochdale that became known as Operation Span, and it was an identical pattern of abuse to what I had seen on Augusta. The same MO, the same modus operandi, the same victims, vulnerable children, the same offenders, picking children up in taxis, taking them to takeaways, grooming them, giving them kebabs and vodka, taking them up on the moors, raping them, taking them to houses, passing them round, 20 men in one room. One of the children that I brought on board with that, her words were that they'd be passed around like a ball. And yet nothing had been done about it. It had come to light 2 years previously, but nothing had happened even then. And the catalyst for Operation Span was that GMP, Greater Manchester Police, had done a routine property review. And in the course of that property review, they had found a fetus in the freezers. And the fetus had been seized about 2 years before from a little girl who the drama called her Ruby, so I'll call her Ruby. They'd found a fetus that had been seized from this little girl, and she had been made pregnant by a 41-year-old married man of 3 children, and the fetus had been seized unlawfully and put in a freezer, but nothing had been done with it. So this routine property review discovered the fetus. There was a real big, commotion, and they, as well as that, the sister of that little girl had been arrested. She was also a victim of this gang. She had been arrested at the age of 15, locked in a cell on suspicion of being a madam, because she was accused of taking other children to the gang to be abused, which was never true. And I was asked whether I would join that job and bring on board some of these extremely vulnerable children, and also tell the family and that little girl whose fetus we'd found that we'd got it, and could we use it for DNA. So despite initial misgivings, because I didn't want to be back in the position I'd been in with Op Augusta, I was given cast iron guarantees that there would not be a repeat of Augusta and the failures I saw there. And eventually I agreed to go on that job. So that was 2010.
Maggie, you continued to lobby your superiors on behalf of the victims for years. You eventually resigned in 2013. Let's fast forward to 2015. These two operations, very, very similar, and one just sort of flows into the other. If I could just take 1 or 2 steps back into the Augusta operation, a couple of questions that come to mind. These offenders pick these little ones up outside of or around care homes, state homes where these kids were living under state care. Would that suggest to you, Maggie, that there was some sort of compliance or knowledge within those organisations as well? It strikes me as unlikely that this is going on at the level, almost like an industrial level that it was, amongst all these children, and those that had responsibility for looking after these children wouldn't have had some knowledge or some involvement? What are your thoughts just on that?
It's not thoughts, Brent. They absolutely categorically knew what was going on. And when Augusta was put together, one of my tasks was to go and speak to the social workers that were responsible for the children that we knew we had a list of about 24 children at the start of Augusta, and we knew that they were being abused on a daily basis because their social workers had been highlighting this and reporting it to the police, and the police had done nothing. It had been going on for years, Brent. And I asked myself many times, why? How could this happen? One of the reasons was that child protection units, still today, but back then, would only deal with abuse of children that were abused by somebody who had what we called care, custody, or control of that child. So a parent or an uncle or a teacher or a football coach, child protection unit would deal with that abuse. Stranger rape was dealt with by CID, but CID didn't deal with child abuse. So these kids were falling in between the cracks. When we went back to start talking to the social workers, they had files of evidence with the names of the men, registration numbers, phone numbers, addresses. It was absolutely known to the authorities, and yet for years it had been hidden. So the fact that the documentary team had uncovered this problem and they were going to make it public, and Victoria, who had been groomed by an identical gang in Manchester but had died, that meant that GMP had to be seen to be doing something about it. I look back now and they didn't truly want to do anything. When I resigned, I started to talk publicly about what I'd seen, and the Mayor of Manchester ordered an independent review to look into Operation Augusta and also the Operation Span. And that review published in 2020, and the official finding was that Augusta was closed down because the Gold Command Group in GMP made the decision that they would not put resources into it. And so they buried that job as though it had never happened. They abandoned the children. They let 100 paedophiles continue to walk the streets. On the back of that review, they've been forced to reopen that case and start all over again. So it's proved. It's not me making it up. It never was. But now I have a public inquiry that corroborates every single word I said from 2005. I am still incredulous, but I haven't just seen it once. I've now seen it repeatedly.
When you look back at these, you look back with hindsight and all the knowledge that you've accumulated over that time. At the time when you move in there, you think this is a genuine attempt to help these kids, to break up this group of pedophiles. Looking back, it seems very clear that Operation Augusta was set up by Greater Metropolitan Police, perhaps in an attempt to deflect what they anticipated was going to be a public backlash from the documentary. When the public backlash didn't occur, or maybe it did initially, but you know what it's like on a news cycle. It's big news today, and then something pops up tomorrow. All of a sudden, they looked at that and thought, well, clearly their motivation wasn't to look after these little ones. Their motivation was to cover their own backside and their own image. So the pushback doesn't come. To shut an operation down, to basically get rid of all the documentation that's been put on computer files, that doesn't happen at sort of senior sergeant level, does it? That happens at a very, very high level. A question that I would ask, and you know, it's so much of what you say, Maggie, is I've heard echoed sitting at the desk here speaking to good people like yourselves who have worked in child exploitation, child abuse. Certainly during the 90s and 2000s, it was sort of seen as not that big a deal. You're right. The CID, they would look after stranger rapes, serial sex crimes, which you and I both know are very rare, but they're sensational because they get all the newspaper stuff, the media love it. So the police have to show, well, yes, we've got a task force, we're after this person. But you and I know most sexual crime never gets reported in the media. It is a huge amounts of it against children, huge amounts of it where the offenders are targeting those that they know that they're connected to. And it seems to be this common theme with officers like yourself through that period. You're constantly having to sort of push back against this attitude. What do you think the motive was to shutting Augusta down? Was there some involvement at a high level? What was the motive just to stop it, shut it down? What are your thoughts?
I've thought about this probably on a daily basis for 20 years. And at first I couldn't really make any sense of it. But over 20 years, I have processed all those thoughts. And I think that there are three reasons for closing Augusta down. I think, first of all, the money. Because the official 2020 report said that Augusta was closed down because the Gold Command Group made the decision that they would not put resources into investigating it. So these kids were from difficult backgrounds. It's always been said in England, I don't know if it's said in Australia, but they were making a lifestyle choice. They were complicit in their abuse. And some of these kids were 11 years old. Nobody loved them. Nobody gave a shit. Nobody was protecting them. And for these kids to be taken out for a pizza, to be taken out in a fancy car, was exciting at first. We'll buy them a packet of fags. They might buy them jewellery. They think they've got a boyfriend. And then that evolves. They're groomed. And then they get a bottle of vodka. And then then it's payback time. So one guy might have sex with them. And then before you know where they're at, or my mates up the road come with me. And these are children of 11 and 12. They are out of their depth. They've got nowhere to go. And they've got nobody fighting their corner. They're not living in a nice middle-class house where the father will go and look after them. They are the most vulnerable children. And the paedophiles who were abusing them knew they were vulnerable. They would sit outside the children's home waiting for them to come out. It was horrific. It still is. It's still going on. And on Augusta, we'd not begun to record the rapes because they were putting the team together. So actually, close down the computer system. There are not going to be 100 unresolved rapes because they've not yet crimed them. So without me speaking out, nobody knew that job had existed because nobody else spoke out. The second thing I would say, now this wasn't officially reported in the 2020 review, but I now know, because my husband died on the 5th of July 2005. On the 6th of July 2005, there was the London bombings, and that caused chaos in England. There was fear of Islamophobia. Everybody was up in arms because it was extremists who had bombed buses and trains and everything in London. It was chaos. It was mayhem. The very last entry on the Augusta database was on the night of the 6th of July. The bombing was on the morning of the 7th. My husband died on the 5th. The last entry on the Augusta job was the night of the 6th. The morning of the 7th was the London bombings. There was not one other entry put on that Home's database after that day. Now, I find that a coincidence too far. So for me, the fear of being accused of being racist, of prosecuting these men, was another factor in closing that job down. The third factor is I know that there was, within the government, there was a feeling that we shouldn't be investigating these sorts of crimes. Now, in 2005, I'm not aware of any emails or circulars, but I do know now that in 2008, the Home Office at the time, under Keir Starmer, who's now the Prime Minister, at that point, he was the Director of Public Prosecutions, and an email was sent out to all police forces that these kind of sexual crimes should not be investigated because the children were making lifestyle choices and they were complicit in their own abuse. And now that was Circular 8 in 2008. So that thinking didn't come out of nowhere. So all those factors for me feed into why Augusta was closed down. Too much money, the kids don't matter. It would feed racial tensions, which were already heightened by the London bombing. And finally, the documentary had gone out. There weren't riots on the streets. So let's let it slide away and bury it as though it's never happened, and nobody will be any the wiser. So for me, Brent, that's what happened. And nobody will ever convince me otherwise, because what I've seen since is a repeat of that behaviour. I saw it on Augusta. With my charity now, the Maggie Oliver Foundation, I'm seeing it time and time again. And yet, even though the official finding was that that job was closed down because the Gold Command Group in GMP wouldn't put resources in, we still have nobody held to account for it. There has been no accountability. And yet, for me, that is gross criminal neglect. It's misconduct in a public office. It's the top echelons of the police deliberately deciding to turn a blind eye to child abuse and child rape. And for me, that's unforgivable, because those 100 men and more were allowed to continue to abuse generations more children without any kind of punishment or consequences. The message clearly sent out is that crack on with what you're doing. We're not going to do anything about it. And for me, that is wicked beyond belief. And I will never accept that. Never. It's wrong on every level. And I've not changed my opinion from then to now, Brent, to be honest.
There was a really confronting statement made to you during this whole time where you were really pushing back very hard against this attitude. And a senior officer basically, rather condescendingly, said to you, Maggie, calm down. What would these kids ever contribute to society? They should have just been drowned at birth. That was the attitude of a senior officer within the command you were working.
Those words were from one of the senior officers when I was kicking off about them deciding that they weren't going to use some of these children as witnesses and victims anymore. They changed their mind. And when I was going ballistic, one of the senior officers said to me, quite as you quite rightly say, Maggie, calm down. Listen, what are these children ever going to contribute to society? They should have been drowned at birth. Now, when you've got senior officers with those kind of attitudes leading these kinds of jobs, you're on a hiding to nothing. They don't understand that their duty is to protect children. Their duty as a police officer is to prosecute old men who are sexually abusing, exploiting and destroying the lives of the most vulnerable children that we have. And he was one of the problems, but at that point in time, Brent, I actually thought that he was the problem, just him. I now know that it wasn't just him. It was the leadership. It was the organisation. It probably goes right up to the government. I was as horrified the second time I saw it as I was on Augusta. But the second time, I did have evidence, and I did make sure that I could prove every word I was saying was correct. I initially was incredulous that I was seeing a repeat of what I'd already seen, but I promised that I was going to try and fight it. But again, really naive, I thought it was that one lazy officer. But I decided that I was going to go up the ranks, and I went to the head of, the public protection unit. I went to the chief constable. I went to the home office. I went to the children's commissioner. I went to the IOPC. Nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. And after 15 months of fighting, whilst I was still a serving police officer, I decided that I had no alternative other than to either, I was told, come to work. What I was actually told, Brent, was that senior officers make decisions and you do as you're told. And if you can't do as you're told, maybe you're in the wrong job. Well, I was not going to do as I was told on this. And I made it very clear that if they didn't do something, I was going to go public. But I was threatened with prison. I was really frightened. It made me, making that decision was a terrifying place to be. And the consequence of it was that I became really ill. My last day at work, I ended up unconscious on the floor. I lost my home. I lost my career. I resigned. I lost my income. I lost my family home that I'd been in for 25 years. I moved into a little apartment. I took in a lodger and I went public, not knowing what the future would hold. But I knew that I wasn't able to walk away from this for a second time. The first time I couldn't prove what I said. The second time I could. It was a terrifying time in my life. Very, very scary.
Coming up, how Maggie's advocacy has led to the establishment of a foundation to help victims. Maggie, you left the job in 2013 after 16 years, and it was some 7 years after that this Operation Augusta that we keep coming back to was, I think reopened is probably the wrong term. I think it was a subject of a perhaps an investigation, which I understand is still in some regards open today. What is the status of this investigation as it currently stands?
Shocking, actually. They reapproached the victims from Augusta, and quite a lot of them agreed to re-engage with the police. It's been renamed Operation Green Jacket. The starting point for Green Jacket was where they buried Operation Augusta. So they picked up the evidence from 2005, and that was the starting point. So they reapproached the victims from Augusta, and many of them agreed that they would work with a new police investigation. And we are now 5 years, nearly 6 years further down the road, and those victims are still being left dangling. I was actually with one on Friday. I was with another one last week. So I know what has been done to them a second time. And when they say things have improved and lessons have been learned, I would point them to the girls that are talking to me. There's been arrests, but for instance, one of the girls, she gave hours of video interviews for Green Jacket. She was asked to identify some of her rapists, which she did. They were put on bail pending further investigations. You can only keep them on bail for a certain length of time, and this investigation dragged on and on and on. The bail was cancelled. They are now still walking the streets, and her evidence and her identifications have still not been acted on. So it is shambolic. It is still a mess. It's a mess. And people will think I'm making it up, Bren, but I'm honestly not. I promise you, on my children's lives, it is the gospel truth.
Maggie, the frustration of endlessly pushing back against the systemic neglect of these young victims and you know, pretty much the non-existent or totally inadequate prosecution of the offenders, your desire to get justice for both those girls and women and others continues to burn very brightly. Can you give us a chat as to what you've done since leaving the job and what you continue to do in this space, Maggie?
When I resigned, all I really wanted to do was to have something concrete there that I could show my kids that I had told the truth and done my best. Because I did believe that this would eventually come out, but it might be when I'm, you know, pushing up daisies and not here anymore. And I want my kids, I don't want them to watch the telly when I'm not here and say, why did my mum not say anything? So I went to Panorama. They were wrapped up in the Jimmy Savile scandal at that point. So they put me in touch with File on 4. I did file on 4, but I brought some of the Rochdale victims in to stand alongside me and tell their stories so that I couldn't be accused of lying. It was the truth. I thought that would be it, Brent, but it wasn't. I was constantly being contacted by people. And perhaps the biggest thing that happened was that a drama team came and spoke to me. And they said they wanted to make this into a BBC drama. And I agreed to work with them on that. And I worked on it for 4 years. And it became the drama Three Girls. We won 6 BAFTAs. It kind of took over everything in the UK for about a week. So everybody was educated then about grooming gangs. And from then, I was asked to go in Celebrity Big Brother. So my profile was quite high. And I was being contacted every day by victims of not just grooming gangs, but all kinds of sexual abuse who were being failed by the police. And I was completely worn out. I was burnt out. And I decided I either had to walk away from this altogether, but leave my learning then behind and all these people who needed help, or I had to try and build an army of people alongside me who could help with the work I was doing. So I decided for my sins that I would start my own charity, which is called the Maggie Oliver Foundation. I started that in 2019. I've now got a team of nearly 40 people working alongside me. We run a legal advocacy service, helping people navigate the criminal justice system if they're being failed. We also have an emotional support service for survivors who just want somebody to speak to. And we give them ongoing weekly support with the same person. And then we will put them through group therapy sometimes. And in the middle, we have what I call the Force for Change work, the campaigning work, the educating professionals, speaking at engagements, talking to the media. So it's kind of taken over my life in many ways. We do phenomenal work. We are not funded by the government, by the state. It's by public donations and people who believe in the work that we are doing, because I will never compromise telling the truth for money, I guess. I think we've got 7 staff members now, about 30 odd volunteers who man the emotional support. So we're doing phenomenal work. And the team that I have are incredible people who all share the same values, really, Brent. You know, that children should be protected, but also that any victim of sexual crime needs to be treated with dignity, with compassion, with respect. And it isn't all about a prosecution. It's about how they are dealt with, how they are treated, how they are listened to and not judged. They're the things that we really value. But if the evidence is there, absolutely, it should lead to a prosecution. So it's quite simple principles, really. I don't think you need to be a police officer to share those principles. It's a question of what's right and wrong, what's good and what's bad. You don't need to have been a police officer to know that a 40-odd or a 50-odd-year-old man who is raping an 11, 12-year-old child is a paedophile, and the law is there to deal with that. It's simple, really.
Maggie, you left the job 12 years ago. You've been a very constant voice in this space, and even more so after 2019, starting your foundation. Can you stand back and look at, let's say, the greater Manchester Police? Have there been any noticeable or tangible changes and improvements, sort of attitudinally or perhaps systemically? Are we in a better place, a different place now than where that department was back in the early 2000s?
The organisation itself would say, yes, everything now is, hunky-dory. And what I would say is that there is a vastly increased awareness now of the reality. Change is very slow and you don't see it as it's going on. But the little girl that was made pregnant when she was just 13, for instance, we had a fetus, we had DNA, we knew who had got her pregnant. She had a statement of special educational needs. We had it all on a plate. And yet the CPS still chose to charge that abuser only with sexual activity with a child, not with rape, because it's an easier offence to prove. You don't need to prove anything. And he was out of prison in less than 4 years, walking round back in Rochdale, and bumped into his child victim in the local supermarket. Now, 4 years is despicable for what that man did. And he didn't just rape one child, he raped many. About 2 months ago here, there was a big case in Yorkshire. Identical offending, identical crime and pattern of behaviour. Those men who were charged on that case were virtually all charged with rape, and they almost all got over 20 years in prison. So that's some progress. But the authorities will still insist that everything is now brilliant. I know from the work I do every day that that's not the case. It is still potluck on how well your case is handled for a whole variety of reasons. So we have got a complaint system that is completely unfit for purpose. It's not independent. It's police marking their own homework, and their overriding priority is still to protect the organisation rather than uphold the rights of the victims. And we still have had not one senior officer held to account for what I consider gross criminal neglect. So we still have a lot of changes to bring. I would say that throughout the UK now, there is a massively increased awareness of the failures that the establishment have condoned. And there is a public outcry for change. Trust in the police, sadly, is at an all-time low here. But I think knowledge is power, and you have to know the truth before you can begin to bring change. And I do think we're in a place here now where the truth is known. People are demanding change, and I mean systemic changes to the whole system. More police officers, better trained, more experienced, investment in public services, courts, prisons are full. We've got a real shortage of prison places, long waits for trial, up to 5 years. It is horrendous. So no, everything isn't better. Have we had change? We have had some. Is it enough? No, it's not. Do I want to see more change? I absolutely do. Still a long way to go.
Maggie, part of me is thinking back to that 42-year-old mother of four that walked into the Manchester Police Academy all those years ago, back in 1997. Could you ever have imagined the path that your life was going to take and where you would be now? You mentioned right at the start of our chat, Maggie, you it's almost preordained. We have these sliding door moments in our lives, don't we, where something happens, the door opens, we step through it, not quite knowing where that's going to take us. And goodness, that decision that you made all those years ago, what a path it's taken you on.
I shouldn't have joined the police. Nobody would have put me in the police. That's why I say maybe it was written in the stars that this was my purpose on this earth. Would I do it again? I don't know. But I think that, when I'm not here anymore, this will be what people remember me for. And just for trying my best to do what I believe is right, and telling the truth and doing my best is all I've tried to do. I didn't do it to become known, to do podcasts, and it just followed me. And nobody else would say what I was saying, although thousands of people knew it was true. That's the question that I ask myself all the time. How could it be that I was the only person that spoke out about what was happening here on a monumental scale? And I guess that's what really still surprises me to this day.
Maggie, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us from the UK. I could sit here so much longer and chat to you. The passion that you have for this, Maggie. I want to thank you for the 16 years of service that you gave to the good people of Manchester, particularly those most vulnerable and in need of someone, with your empathy. And thank goodness for people like you and for the decision that you made all those years ago to join the job. Maggie, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brent. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Crime Insiders Detectives is a LiSTNR original podcast. The production team for this episode was Holly Mitchell, Jade Murray and Link Kelly. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. I'm Brent Sanders. Thanks for listening.